The popular vision of a medieval battle is something almost operatic, a sweeping panorama of shining armor, flaring banners, and noble warriors locked in graceful, honorable combat. In this myth, the ground is firm, the sun is high, and the noise is a symphony of clash and cry. Men charge with purpose, swords meet cleanly, and victory is measured in courage. In this version, a knight might fall with a final whispered prayer, blood staining his tunic as if painted there by design, surrounded by awestruck witnesses to his sacrifice. Hollywood, heroic poetry, and even centuries of misremembered chroniclers have sold us a curated version of medieval warfare, one that elevates suffering to spectacle and dresses agony in silk and silver. But that image is not just misleading, it is grotesquely false. The truth of medieval battlefields was not heroic. It was not clean. It was not even recognizable as the combat we imagine. It was choking confusion, the smell of bile and human waste mixing with iron and rot, the weight of dozens of men pressing in until the ground itself became indistinguishable from the bodies upon it. There were no elegant duels, no shining heroes, no singular acts of honor that defined the day. Instead, there were screams lost in chaos, eyes blinded by panic, and blades that did not slice so much as crush through padded cloth and shattered bone. The rhythm of battle was not choreographed, dead. It was frantic, filthy, and cruel. Accounts from those who survived rarely speak of triumph. They speak of madness, of disorientation, of the loss of time and the way the sun seemed to vanish behind a haze of sweat and steam. The noise was not glorious, it was unbearable. The clang of iron was drowned beneath howls of fear, the gurgling of punctured lungs, the sudden silence of death. Many veterans of these battles never again raised a sword, not because of wounds to their bodies, but because of wounds to their minds. The battlefield did not forge honor. It crushed the soul beneath mailed boots and the weight of 100 dead comrades. And yet, even now, we wrap these events in flags and tales. We speak of knights as if they were more than men, as if pain bent for them, as if they fell with dignity rather than desperation. We forget that most soldiers were not knights. We forget that armor rarely shone after an hour in the melee, that war horses slipped in blood and were hacked down where they stood. We forget the stink of rot, of urine, of ruptured bowels spilled across the grass. We forget that many died not from the blow of a blade, but from suffocation, trampled under the weight of retreating friends and collapsing enemies. Archaeological excavations of mass graves from battles like Visby in 1361 reveal skulls caved in from behind, limbs severed mid-flight, faces crushed into pulp by weapons that were not designed for finesse, but for annihilation. These were not deaths met standing. They were executions, slow suffocations, bludgeonings in the mud. Fragments of jawbones have been found with teeth shattered inward, suggesting blunt trauma to the face, a hammer, a mace, or a boot. Some skeletons show 5, even 10 wounds, suggesting their killers kept striking long after the victim was already dying or dead. Medieval battle was not just violence. It was disfigurement, dehumanization, and despair. It did not reward bravery as much as it punished hesitation. It had no memory for courage, only for carnage. And when the sun finally set, it illuminated not honor, but ruin. Armor twisted into flesh, blood congealing in the dirt, and silence so complete it seemed to mock the slaughter that had come before. Those who stood on those fields knew the truth. They did not see war as noble. They saw it as a storm that consumed everything in its path, reason, faith, and identity included. And though kings might have sung of victory, the men who walked away, limping, broken, silent, knew that there were no victors, only survivors. Despite popular imagination, most of the men who fought and died on medieval battlefields were not armored knights mounted on heavy horses. They were not noblemen with names etched in family records or elite warriors raised in martial tradition. They were butchers, millers, thatchers, blacksmiths, and field hands, pulled from villages by conscription, feudal obligation, or desperate need for coin. In truth, The bulk of medieval armies was composed of men who had never held a sword until the day they were told to kill with one. They were farmers handed spears, tailors burdened with axes, and young boys whose first true memory of combat was watching a friend's teeth driven into his throat by a flanged mace. Knights did exist, and they did fight, but they were few, and their martial skill did not make them invincible. They trained for war, yes, but even they were not the graceful warriors of legend. Their movements were limited by dozens of pounds of layered metal and leather. Their breath fogged inside stifling helmets. Their vision narrowed to a slit. They were not gallant heroes leaping over foes, but lumbering towers trying not to fall. Worse still, for every knight there were dozens of levied men-at-arms, conscripted archers, and untrained foot soldiers thrown together under banners they barely recognized, commanded by lords they had never spoken to and likely never would. Preparation was a luxury, not a guarantee. For many, training consisted of being handed a pike, a few shouted drills, and a rough position in the line. English longbowmen might have had practice from boyhood, their spines warped and arms thickened by years of pulling the 100-pound war bows used at battles like Agincourt. But they were the exception, not the rule. Most foot soldiers had no armor. If they were lucky, they might possess a padded gambeson, a quilted linen jacket, heavy and soaked in sweat within minutes. Chainmail was rare outside the nobility. Plate armor even rarer still, reserved for those who could afford both the cost of its forging and the servants required to don it. Weapons were often crude, improvised, or second-hand. A rusted sickle could serve in place of a sword. A sharpened hoe might be repurposed into a halberd. Axes intended for firewood were strapped to belts and swung with trembling hands. Even professionally forged weapons were not tools of elegance. They were made to kill, not to duel. War hammers shattered helmets, crushing the skull beneath without needing to pierce it. Maces bypassed armor entirely, their weight pulverizing organs through mail and plate alike. Swords, where present, were not for clashing in cinematic rhythm. They were for hacking into flesh when the spear broke or was lost in the crush. Helmets, when available, came in crude forms. The nasal helm, which obscured most of the face. The kettle hat, which offered protection from above but little from the sides. Or the simple iron skull cap that sat unevenly atop a frightened man's brow. Many men fought bareheaded or with nothing more than a leather cap. Their only defense a prayer murmured before the trumpet's cry. Food was often rancid, water foul, and the march to battle long and blistering. Soldiers arrived on the field already dehydrated, sleep-deprived, and aching. They carried the weight of not only their gear, but their fear, a quiet dread that thickened with every hour. The lucky few might have seen one battle before. Most had not. They would learn what it meant to fight in the opening minutes, or not at all. Even those who called themselves professionals, mercenaries or household guards, fought not out of loyalty or idealism, but for coin. When pay ran dry, so did their allegiance. Some switched sides mid-campaign. Others disappeared the night before a battle, their conscience stronger than their contract. No oath could bind a man who knew what awaited beyond the shield wall. And so these were the people who made up medieval armies, a fractured mass of fear and flesh, held together not by courage, but by compulsion, poverty, or accident. They were not warriors by nature. They were men placed in the path of horror, ill-prepared and expendable. They wore the clothes of the field, gripped the tools of survival, and marched into battle with no assurance they would return. Only the knowledge that if they did, they would not come back the same. A medieval battlefield was not a grand stage. It was a swamp, a ditch, a fallow field pocked with holes, dung, and discarded limbs of animals left to rot days before. The ground beneath thousands of boots could turn from firm soil to a treacherous, ankle-deep mire in minutes. From a distance, the sight of a battle appeared like a dark tide swelling upon itself, banners swaying in broken rhythm, clouds of dust rising above twisted columns, the gleam of metal glinting under a sun that offered no mercy. But within that tide, vision was nearly useless. The mass of bodies closed in around itself like a living prison. Helmets narrowed sight to a thin slit. Shields blocked what little view remained. The breath of the man in front mixed with your own, and if he fell, his collapse became your trap. There were no lines, no formations, no clarity. In the thick of it, direction dissolved. One could not tell where friend ended and enemy began. Sound was its own weapon, overwhelming and constant. Horses screamed when pierced. Men bellowed in rage, terror, or agony. The grinding of iron on bone was muffled beneath the roar of thousands of lungs struggling to breathe through blood and fear. Orders were shouted, but few heard them. Horns blew, drums beat, but their rhythm vanished beneath the stamping of feet, the squelch of mud, the crash of men colliding like freight carts in a storm. The battlefield was not a symphony. It was a deafening, maddening wall of noise. Some went half mad from it, others simply froze. The smell clung to everything: sweat, leather, horse manure, blood. Not just blood as from a cut finger, but the wet stench of arterial spray, the sickly sweet odor of opened stomachs, the putrid reek of bowels voided in death or fear. Armor trapped it against the skin. Gambesons soaked it up like a sponge. By midday, the heat within a helmet could make breathing feel like drowning in steam. Confusion was constant. One moment a soldier might think the enemy was in retreat. A minute later he might realize the line had broken and he was surrounded. A raised weapon might pause, unsure if the shape beneath the dented helm was friend or foe. Mistaken kills were common. Some fell under friendly swords before they could speak. Others deliberately struck their comrades to break a path to safety. The fog of war was not a metaphor. It was a choking, blinding, all-consuming reality. Of smoke, of dust, of adrenaline too loud to hear your own thoughts. Many battles began in the early morning, but few ended before sunset. The sun became a cruel overseer, baking metal to the point of burns. Under the weight of iron and exhaustion, every step became an act of will. Knees buckled, ankles twisted, blisters turned to bleeding sores. A dropped weapon might vanish beneath trampled grass or sink beneath footprints. Few retrieved them. Most fought with what they could grab: a rock, a fallen blade, the haft of a shattered spear. Death could come not only from an enemy blade, but from heat stroke, dehydration, trampling, or collapse from exhaustion. The body could give out long before the enemy arrived. There were no places of safety, no pockets of peace. The wounded screamed beside the dead. Some crawled from the fray only to be run down by cavalry. Archers loosed blind volleys, arrows falling on friend and foe alike. Horses stumbled into pits or slipped on blood-slick grass. Men crushed beneath them vanished from view, buried beneath hooves and weight. The terrain offered no favors. Even slight hills became traps for retreating men, slopes where blood pooled and movement slowed. Every tree could block a path. Every ditch could become a grave. There were no ideal locations, only slightly less horrific ones. And when it rained, the misery turned biblical. The ground became a churning paste of mud, feces, and blood. Men slipped, fell, drowned in puddles too shallow to deserve the name. Armor turned to anchors. Weapons clung with sticky resistance. Everything stuck. To your boots, to your limbs, to your soul. Visibility dropped to nothing. Hands groped in the mist for enemies they could not see. The wet air chilled to the bone. Teeth chattered inside helmets. Rust formed before battle even ended. The very earth became hostile, dragging every motion down into itself. In every sense, the battlefield was not a place of noble confrontation. It was a nightmare where nature itself seemed complicit in the destruction. There was no clean soil, no noble footing, no stage on which to perform heroic feats. There was only chaos, overwhelming, disorienting, unrelenting, and the fragile human body trying not to be broken by it. When the signal was given and the line surged forward, the battle did not begin like a dance. It began like a collapse. Two masses of moving flesh slammed into one another with the violence of a landslide. There was no elegance, no spacing, no room for footwork or form. Spears jabbed blindly. Shields crashed together. Men screamed, stumbled, shoved, and struck without rhythm or grace. It was not battle as taught in chivalric tales. It was panic wrapped in steel and leather. In the first clash, everything was noise and impact. The sound of wood splintering, the wet crack of metal hitting bone, the shrieks of men impaled or pinned. The weight of bodies pressed in so tightly that movement became restricted to inches. Weapons could not be swung. They were jabbed, rammed, or slammed into the nearest shape. Men fought with shoulders, teeth, knees, and elbows. Helmets were pulled off, throats exposed and bitten or slashed. It was not uncommon for fighters to be crushed in place before even striking a blow. The line dissolved almost immediately. Banners were lost, officers cut down, and formations shattered like glass underfoot. Dust filled the air. Chaff from trampled grass, blood spray from opened arteries, and steam from 100 panicked bodies pouring sweat inside suffocating armor. Vision blurred with heat and fear. Even experienced fighters admitted that in the crush of melee, they often closed their eyes and swung, hoping to connect with something that was not one of their own. Some soldiers collapsed, not from wounds, but from terror. They fainted mid-charge or lost control of their bowels before first contact. Others froze, unable to lift their weapon, their brains screaming for flight even as their feet refused to move. A man's courage lasted seconds. Then instinct took over, or failed him entirely. Weapons that survived the first minute dulled or broke. Swords bent from striking bone. Spears shattered when trampled or caught on mail. Axes stuck in ribs and refused to come free. Many ended up fighting with their fists, clubs, or whatever they pulled from the ground. A rock, a helmet, a severed limb. Some tried to flee and were run down by cavalry. Others lay on the ground, pretending to be dead until a careless boot exposed their ruse and ended it. Pain was constant, but not always immediate. Adrenaline masked wounds. Men kept fighting with cracked ribs, pierced thighs, even collapsed lungs. Some did not realize they were dying until they fell, and when they did fall, others stepped over them, on them, or into them. A collapsed man rarely rose again. He was buried in feet, trampled until ribs snapped and skulls fractured under the weight of terrified comrades. The idea of individual duels faded quickly. In the melee, no one cared who they killed, only that they lived another few minutes. There was no room to recognize faces, to weigh honor, or to issue challenge. If a foe stumbled, he was stabbed. If he turned to flee, he was cut down. Mercy was a myth. Prisoners were a luxury. The safest man was the one who struck first, hardest, and without hesitation. Blows did not land with cinematic clarity. They landed with sickening weight. The thud of a mace hitting a helmet sounded like a sack of stones dropped into wet clay. The shriek of a blade across mail was followed by a grunt, a cough, or silence. A warhammer's impact could knock a man unconscious, even if it didn't kill him. That moment of stillness, the body slackening, the knees giving way, was often the last glimpse before the next enemy surged into view, and it never stopped. Time dissolved. Minutes stretched into hours. The sun seemed frozen overhead, the battle without end. Men fought in circles, retreated without knowing, advanced without plan. Everything became about survival. Not victory, not duty. Only the hope that the next strike wouldn't come from behind or from above, or from someone they never saw. Some fell from exhaustion and were finished on the ground. Some crawled away and bled out behind bushes. Some kept swinging until their hands were too numb to grip, their arms too weak to lift, their eyes too swollen to see. And when it was over, those who had lived often wept, not out of relief, but because they could not understand why they were still breathing. Medieval battle was not a trial of strength or skill. It was a chaos machine that devoured the prepared and unprepared alike. There was no grace in it, no heroism, only fear, noise, pain, and the overwhelming certainty that nothing human could survive it unchanged. Death in a medieval battle did not always come with a flash of steel or a cinematic gasp. More often, It arrived as a slow, creeping failure of the body under conditions so merciless, so random, so overwhelming, that many men never even saw the moment that ended them, whether crushed beneath collapsing comrades, trampled by horses they never heard approach, or impaled by weapons thrust blindly through gaps in armor without aim or recognition. Contrary to what tales and paintings suggest, the majority of injuries inflicted on the battlefield were not clean or surgical. Swords rarely cut cleanly through flesh unless wielded with extraordinary force and precision, which was nearly impossible in the press of bodies, and instead the blows landed at awkward angles, smashing bones, tearing skin, and crushing tissue in ways that left limbs dangling, eyes destroyed, jaws shattered, and ribs snapped inward like splinters piercing the lungs they were meant to protect. Weapons like maces and warhammers were designed not to pierce but to deform, to cave in helmets, to collapse faces into skulls, to send shock waves through armor that ruptured organs without spilling a drop of blood until the dying man coughed it from his mouth. And even when men wore protection, that armor became a trap, heating their bodies to the point of collapse and locking shattered bones in place beneath layers of steel they could not remove. Archaeological evidence tells the truth that stories refuse to. Mass graves uncovered at sites like Visby in Sweden show hundreds of skeletons still wearing their chainmail, many with legs severed at the knees or shins, their skulls showing signs of repeated trauma, not from a single elegant blow, but from multiple desperate strikes with nasal bones crushed, eye sockets caved in, and teeth driven backward into the throat. Not as acts of vengeance, but as the blunt reality of a fight where hesitation meant death. Even men who survived the initial impact often succumbed within hours or days, not because their wounds were always fatal in themselves, but because there was almost no medical aid that could meaningfully treat them. Deep cuts became infected within hours. Shattered limbs turned gangrenous. Punctured lungs filled with fluid until the wounded drowned on their backs, and there were no antiseptics, no sterilized blades, no morphine, no understanding of sepsis or internal bleeding. Just cloth rags pressed to wounds, prayers muttered over fevered brows, and saws sharpened for the inevitable amputations that followed. Those amputations were rarely precise, and certainly never painless. When a limb had to be removed, it was done with a saw held by a surgeon who may have once been a butcher, with men holding the patient down while he screamed, or bit through leather, or passed out from the agony. And if he didn't die from blood loss or shock on the spot, the odds of infection rising in the days that followed remained almost certain, as the open wound festered beneath flies and filth with no antibiotics and no hope beyond the body's raw chance at endurance. Some of the most common causes of death were not from blades at all, but from suffocation beneath the press of bodies, where a man who fell might live for several minutes with his face in the mud, unable to breathe under the weight of 2 or 3 others collapsed on top of him, slowly losing consciousness as his lungs filled with soil, blood, or the thick sweat of another's dying breath. And the terror of that kind of death, silent and unseen, was something many feared more than the sword itself. Others were killed by their own side, not out of betrayal, but out of confusion or fear, struck from behind in the chaos by a panicked ally, or left behind as a unit withdrew without noticing them. And in the blindness of battle, a friendly uniform was no protection. Not when blood had darkened every cloth and dust had obscured every color, and the only way to survive was to attack whatever shape moved nearest before it struck you first. And for those too badly wounded to walk but not lucky enough to die on the field, the final blow might come from a scavenger, whether a peasant combing the dead for loot, or a retreating soldier looking to silence the moaning cries that might draw attention, or a mercy killer assigned to dispatch the hopeless, with a dagger slipped between the ribs, or a hammer to the temple, or the blade of a knife pressed through the eye socket where no armor could protect. This was how men truly died in medieval battles. Not in heroic poses, not in defiant last stands with swords raised against the dusk, but on their knees, choking on their own blood, limbs broken at unnatural angles, eyes wide with pain, lungs gasping for breath that would never come, as the world turned gray around them, and the last sound they heard was not the roar of victory, but the low groan of the dying all around them. When the screaming finally ceased and the clang of steel gave way to silence, The battlefield did not feel like a place of victory or defeat. It felt like a graveyard that had swallowed the living. A vast, reeking expanse of twisted limbs and sunken chests, where the air hung heavy with the stink of sweat, blood, horse guts, and the unmistakable scent of excrement voided in terror or death. And in that breathless pause, even the survivors did not cheer, for their mouths were too dry, their throats too raw, and their minds too stunned to form the shape of anything like triumph. Some sat in the dirt and wept without sound. Their weapons dropped, their gauntlets peeled from blistered hands, too tired to speak, and too shocked to process what they had done or seen, while others walked aimlessly through the wreckage, stepping over severed arms and crushed helmets, looking not for enemies or comrades, but for their own sense of presence, to confirm that they were still alive, still awake, and not trapped in some nightmare conjured by the devil to punish them for sins they did not understand. There were always those who vomited, the stench of the field too much to bear now that the adrenaline had faded, and some dropped to their knees in prayer, not from piety, but from desperation, clutching the cross around their neck or smearing blood into a crude symbol on the dirt in hopes that some higher power might offer comfort where none could be found among the mangled heaps of humanity around them. Looting came quickly, not because the men were cruel or greedy, but because necessity left no time for guilt. Armor was stripped from corpses before the bodies had cooled, weapons pried from fingers still locked in rigor mortis, boots taken from the dead even if they were soaked through with blood, and coin purses cut from belts with trembling hands, for war was never clean, and survival demanded more than just strength. It demanded anything that could be sold, traded, or reused before the next battle arrived. Some searched not for profit, but for friends, their eyes scanning ruined faces for familiar scars or half-remembered tunics, calling names into the silence only to be answered by groans or the terrible quiet of nothing at all. And when they found the bodies, if they did, there was no time for proper burial, no priest to recite rites, no mother to close the eyes, only the crude mercy of piling a few stones or crossing 2 sticks and whispering something, anything, into the bloodied wind. Wounds were treated with what little could be mustered. Wine poured into gashes until the screaming became unbearable. Bandages torn from tunics, splints fashioned from broken arrows or spear shafts. And when limbs were too far gone to save, they were cut off with dull blades, while the patient was held down and gagged, the saw grinding through tendon and bone with a noise that many could not forget even decades later, not because of its volume, but because of the deep, visceral understanding it brought, that survival was no guarantee of wholeness. In some cases, men wandered away from the field entirely, their minds fractured by the scale of what they had seen, walking for hours or days without direction, collapsing in villages where no one recognized them, or returning home unable to explain what had happened with words, speaking only in fragments or not at all, haunted not just by death, but by the echoing memory of how it felt to deliver it. Chroniclers sometimes recorded the aftermath with cold detachment, counting corpses, noting names, describing outcomes in terms of land gained or banners taken. But they did not write about the boy found still clutching his mother's letter in his chest pocket, or the old soldier who spent hours digging graves for men whose names he did not know, pausing between each one to wipe his eyes and mutter prayers in a voice nearly broken by exhaustion. And when night finally fell, it did not bring peace, but a terrible, suffocating quiet, broken only by the occasional scream of a wounded man left in the field too far to reach, or the howl of wolves descending from nearby woods to begin the gruesome feast, and those who had survived huddled together near campfires, not for warmth, but for the presence of another breathing body, as if to confirm that the world still held something living amid all that ruin. Though even in that flickering light, few spoke and fewer slept, for the darkness behind their eyes was far louder than the silence around them. Surviving the battlefield did not mean returning whole, for many of those who walked away from the carnage carried wounds invisible to the eye, injuries that did not bleed but festered inside the mind, where no poultice could reach. And long after the swords had been sheathed and the armor stowed away, the true weight of what they had endured began to settle upon them, heavy as iron. unrelenting as winter, and often more unbearable than anything they had felt beneath the blade. In the months and years that followed, countless men were never quite the same, their faces marked not by scars of war, but by expressions of absence. Hollow eyes that no longer saw what was in front of them, hands that trembled even in stillness, and mouths that rarely opened except to mutter prayers, screams in the night, or the same few words repeated without meaning, like a wheel turning in mud with no end in sight. And it was not uncommon for wives to say that their husbands had returned from battle, but the men they had married never did. They withdrew from laughter, from touch, from the everyday rhythms of life, and sat alone by empty hearths, staring into fires long after they had died down, their thoughts consumed not by politics or property or God, but by memories they could not suppress. The sound of a man dying with a spear through his gut, the feel of a friend's blood on their hands, the color of the sky above the field where they had knelt amid a pile of corpses, wondering whether they would be the next to join it. Sleep became a battlefield of its own, dreams interrupted by visions of mangled faces, of screaming horses, of mud clinging to broken fingers, and many chose not to close their eyes at all, wandering the streets or fields until dawn, lost in memory, unable to explain why the sound of thunder made them flinch, or why the sight of red cloth made them turn pale. For the triggers were everywhere, and the mind, once broken open by war, did not easily seal shut again. Some became angry, their tempers fraying like old rope, snapping at wives, striking children, unable to speak without shouting or retreating into silence, while others grew fearful of crowds, of noise, of sudden movements, and avoided the company of men they had once called brothers, knowing that they could no longer share words without remembering how those same mouths had once screamed or prayed as they bled out beside them. And this fear was not weakness, but a scar, deep, invisible, and raw. Records from the period, though often filtered through religious language or the cold lens of official chronicles, speak of men who wandered into monasteries and never left, of soldiers who gave up their land and chose to live in huts alone in the forest, speaking to no one, surviving on roots and silence, of knights who threw their swords into rivers and swore never to take up arms again, not because they had found peace, but because they had lost the ability to function in a world where death was not the air they breathed. Some described them as cursed or possessed, claiming they were haunted by demons or the devil himself. But what they truly suffered was something beyond the reach of theology, a sickness of the soul that had no name, no cure, and no understanding in an age that praised bravery and punished weakness, and so they hid it as best they could, smiling with hollow eyes, drinking until the memories blurred, or disappearing entirely into the forests and wastelands, hoping that in solitude they might escape the echoes of what they had seen. The chronicler Jean de Joinville wrote of one veteran who never again passed through a town square without scanning the faces for threats, his hand always hovering near his belt, his shoulders tight, his steps short and cautious. And even though he lived another 20 years after the Battle of Mansoura, he never again attended a feast, a wedding, or a market without asking first how many men would be present and whether the exits could be reached quickly, just in case. A man forever caught in the moments of a fight that had ended decades before. Even in death, these men were often silent, their stories buried with them, their wounds passed down only through the strange behaviors their children observed and imitated without understanding. The distant stares, the sudden outbursts, the long hours of silence. And history, in its hunger for kings and campaigns, has largely forgotten the broken ones, the haunted ones, the thousands who came back not as victors or heroes, but as shadows of the men they had once been. And so, when we speak of medieval battle today, when we recount the names of great wars, or marvel at swords in museums, or read of knights and glory, we must remember that for most who fought, the story did not end when the trumpet fell silent or the last banner was raised, for their war continued in the mind, unseen but unending, and its wounds were deeper than any blade could ever reach.